Alright, so this is the Knife Thoughts full review for this knife. This is the LionSteel CollectorKnives WarHorse. So don't forget, this video goes along with an article at knifethoughts.com. So go to knifethoughts.com, subscribe via email so you get notifications when I post new articles, and check out the article that goes along with this knife. But this is a knife that I've been looking forward to for a while. It's a CollectorKnives exclusive, and Mike Latham of CollectorKnives had put this knife on the early reserve several months ago, I think at the beginning of 2019. And I decided that I wanted to get one because he had previously done a special factory order through Great Eastern Cutlery of the number 77 Northfield Barlow with this same blade shape combination. The two full-size blades, one being a clip point, one being a Wharncliffe. And at the time, you know, it was a little too expensive for me and stuff, and I didn't get one, but I've kind of wished that I had been able to for a while here, especially in the abalone color. So when I saw that he was doing one of these modern Barlows with the same blade shapes, I thought I'd check one out. So it's, like I said, a LionSteel made knife. You can see it says LionSteel Italy CK edition. And it is a modern Barlow. So the first thing, the first traditional aspect of this knife is the fact that it's a non-locking knife. It's a slip joint, as you can see. So these are springs, and it holds the blades closed and open, but there's no lock. As you can see, there is a half stop, but there's no lock to, you know, lock the blade closed or open. And that's a really traditional thing for a Barlow. Almost all traditional Barlows are slip joints, although there have been some more recent ones made with lockbacks. But that's a very traditional aspect, that you know, non-locking slip joint mechanism. The next thing is that it is does have the frame and bolster of a Barlow. So a good comparison here, speaking of GEC, is the Great Eastern Cutlery TC Barlow. I'd show one of Mike's Northfield Barlows, but I don't have one in my collection right now, unfortunately. Maybe soon, as he is having another run of those made. But this is a Great Eastern Cutlery number 15 TC Barlow, and you can see that they have this same jack frame. So it's rounded at the bottom, and then also rounded but a little bit more square. It's a square top. You can see that there's an angle here at the transition, although the top is rounded. So the same type of frame, and then more importantly, to make it a Barlow, it has this elongated bolster. So this elongated bolster is really what makes a knife a Barlow. There are some specifics that people, you know, say of it being 1/3 the length of the handle, and that certainly seems to be the case with this knife. Basically, it just has to be elongated. So in comparison to something like this Case Trapper, you can see that the bolster is significantly elongated on the two Barlows. So it is traditionally, it fits the Barlow kind of name with this frame shape and the elongated bolster. But then we kind of get away from, so a couple more traditional things. The blade shape. So like I say, these are traditional clip point and Wharncliffe blade shapes. You see it has swedges, cut swedges, and it is a two-hand opening knife. So traditional clip and Wharncliffe blade shapes, and it uses long pulls to open. It's not a one-hand opening knife. But that's kind of where the traditionality stops. You can see that unlike how a traditional knife is generally built with pins, the WarHorse is built with torque screws. So these screws can be taken out. Now, I'm not 100% sure on this, as I did not take this knife apart, but I don't think it can be fully taken apart. I'm not sure on that. It could be true, or it could be the case that it can be taken fully apart, but I think that there is, the pivot is pinned, possibly. that's something that you'll have to check with. I'm not exactly sure on that, and I don't plan to take it apart. But certainly the bolsters can be removed, as well as the handle scales, because in the other modern LionSteel Barlows that Collector Knives has had made, they've had different anodized color bolsters, and there's lots of different handle materials. So the Torx screws are certainly, a departure from the traditionality. Another departure is the way that these long pulls are done. So you can see that they are on both sides of the blade, both sides, whereas usually on a traditional knife they're only on one side. That is something that honestly it's nice that they're on both sides. It makes it so they are easier to open, easier to get at, rather than if they had a nail nick here. And I'll talk about these long pulls a little bit more later. But another thing that's not as traditional about this knife is the fact that it has what's a stop pin in there. So that's actually a stop pin. The blades actually rest against or hit against that pin in this cutout here. So that could be considered a sharpening notch, but it's also where the stop pin hits. And I really like that feature because it keeps the edge from being able to hit the backspring. A lot of traditional knives, like this, if you allow the blade to close of its own strength, fully close, it will bounce down and hit the backspring and roll the edge. And that's not going to happen with this knife because of that stop pin. So I really like that. Another thing that's not as traditional about this knife is how it's put together. So if you look at this knife, and this isn't the best example because it's been used a lot, but the transitions between the handle and the bolster and the spring and the liners are all very smooth. They have been polished. Now, these are smooth in the sense that they're rounded. Because this is screwed together and not pinned, they can't actually polish those back springs and the areas between the handles, handle material and the bolster, because they are actually screwed on at a later point in the production of the knife. So rather, they're rounded. And this is something that you see on other LionSteel made knives. Now this is actually a steel will gecko, but I can tell, and I'm pretty sure that it's made by LionSteel because it also has that rounding. So that's something that is necessitated by the fact that it is a screw construction knife rather than a pin construction. And it has that rounded, kind of almost stonewashed. It's like a very light, fine stonewashing on the bolsters and the back springs and the liners there. So that's another difference. And finally, it also has non-traditional materials. So although you can't tell by looking at it, other than the fact that it says the steel, it has a really high-end steel. So this is an M390 steel blade on both the blades. And M390 is a pretty new steel. It's definitely considered a super steel because it performs well kind of across. It's not the best at any of these, but it performs really well across edge holding, wear resistance, toughness, and stain resistance or corrosion resistance, and it's not too difficult to sharpen. I've used M390 a little bit, but not too much, and to be honest, I didn't use this knife. So I haven't gotten the chance to try it out, and there's a lot of stuff, or there was recently going on about M390 and how it's heat treated and stuff. Basically, I trust that LionSteel is doing a good job of this M390. I got to talk with Mike Latham at the Great Eastern Cutlery Rendezvous quite a bit, and it sounds like everybody. It's possible that there's a knife that gets through with mistakes, as with any company, but it sounds like they're really doing a lot to make sure that they're making the knives the right way and making knives that customers will be happy with and that are well worth the price that they're paying for them. For example, they were willing to work with Mike on this stop pin and changed one of the small details about it. Rather than being a floating pin, it's screwed in now so that it doesn't move around and cause some things that people saw as issues. And also, they took out, originally there was a liner between these two blades and springs, and Mike asked them to take that out, and they were willing to work with him on that. So I do think that LionSteel is a company that and has leadership that wants to make knives the right way. So I trust that M390 is going to perform the way that I expect it to. Again, I didn't use it, but I do think that it would had I used it. One other aspect of this knife that is not traditional that I forgot to mention is that it does have washers. So you can see that there's a washer between the two blades, and then there's also a washer on the outside of each blade. What that does is it makes it so that it has really nice smooth action right out of the box. I mean, very, very, very smooth. Like smooth as really the best GECs. But it also does, because there is space from the washers, kind of necessitate the fact that there are small gaps. So there are some small gaps there due to those washers. But really high-end materials, as I was saying. It has the M390, very good blade steel, and one that when I have used it, I've been happy with it. And then the bolsters are titanium, so a very lightweight and tough for its weight steel, generally used on a lot of high-end knives and modern knives. And then I went with the carbon fiber handle. Now they also have olive wood, ebony, ram's horn, which a lot of people really like the ram's horn. It seems like really high quality lamb's horn that LionSteel gets, and natural micarta. And all of those are kind of up to personal taste, but I went with the carbon fiber because I think it kind of helps to gap that modern and traditional. Knives have had synthetic handles for decades and decades, starting with different celluloid and micarta and things like that. But carbon fiber is definitely seen as a more modern handle material, and it's a very sleek handle material. And this carbon fiber looks really nice. There's really not any gaps or voids that I can see, and I really like the finish. It's a nice matte finish, so it does give some texture to it, but still keeping that nice kind of sheen. So nice high-end materials, and I'm really happy with it. And it's a really well-made knife. So like I say, super smooth right out of the box. The pull is, I'd say, slightly above a 5. If a 5 is the typical Swiss Army knife, A-lock Swiss Army knife. Maybe a 5 1/4, not too much above, maybe even right at. And both blades are exactly the same as far as I can tell on the pull. Really nice action, as you can see. Snaps to that half stop. Let me do it without having my arms on the table. Snaps to the half stop. Snaps closed with nice walk and talk. Sounds good. Snaps open and closed well. And just a really nice action. And then they are centered well. So you can see that the tips are evenly spaced. And one nice thing that I like, that I noticed, is that the tips sit nice and deep in the frame, but they do come almost all the way to the end, so that you're getting pretty much as much blade out of this handle as you can get. Now the back springs do come up, so it's not like you're gonna snag on those tips. It's just that they come really nicely all the way to the end of the handle. So built really well, no blade play on either blade either. And part of that, both on the action and the blade play, is due to those washers. Now as for the design, I really like it. You can see that it's a little bit bigger than the TC Barlow, and it's right around the size of the number 77 Northfield Barlow that Gradation Cutlery makes. So if you're familiar with those, this is right around that. In comparison, size-wise, to something, maybe a more well-known modern knife, this is a Spyderco Andorra, and then I also have a Rat 1, and finally, again, the Case Trapper. So it's a little bigger than the GEC 15 frame, right around the 77. And I really like it as a size for, you know, a pocket knife. It is certainly big enough that you can get all 4 fingers on, but it's small enough that you can carry it and, you know, not have to worry about it. Now, as for the size, one thing that a lot of people were wondering about is that with 2 back springs, 2 kind of full-size back springs, is it going to be too thick? It is a thick knife. So in comparison to the Case Trapper, which also has 2 back springs and even has a spacer, the WarHorse is thicker. So it's definitely a thick knife. It's a chunky knife. But one thing is, I do think that that thickness helps keep the secondary blade from being too much in the way of your hand. So when I grab this, because it is thicker, my fingers kind of wrap around that blade rather than, you know, digging into it. And the same is true for the other blade. I actually find the clip to be a little bit more comfortable. And one thing someone mentioned is, do these tangs stick into the finger? So I do think that they kind of do a little bit, but no more certainly than on a 2-bladed traditional knife like a Case or, you know, a gradation cutlery. Especially gradation cutlery doesn't really polish this section of the tang. Case does it real hard, but gradation cutlery doesn't really do it at all. I actually did it a little bit on this one, and it's still relatively sharp. But LionSteel did, so you can see that there's some chamfering on there, and that's true for both of the blades. So although it does stick out a little bit, and you can feel it when you're holding on to it here, it's not sharp, it just sticks out. So that's something where, you know, if you're not a too big fan of 2-blade traditional knives because of that, it's something to be aware of, but it's not a huge deal for me. If I was going to use this knife, I don't think I would notice it, especially because the truth is, when you're using a knife, you're most often going to hold it like this. So, you know, your finger might rest on that a little bit, but you're going to be using it in a pinch grip mostly, and it won't be a huge deal. More so, you might notice on the when you're using the clip point blade that you're going to, you know, have the spine of the Wharncliffe in the kind of crease of your finger there. So the ergonomics, because it's wider, are pretty good, although those tangs do stick out a little bit. And one thing that I've noticed is that although these long poles are made well, they're, you know, on both sides so that you can access it, you know, easily get at it. I do find that on the pile side, the Wharncliffe, my fingernail seems to want to slip off of it a little bit. And the reason for that is that if you see in there, these long poles are rounded. So they have a rounded inside edge there. And that's true for both. For whatever reason, this one seems to, you know, slip a little bit more. I don't necessarily think it's shallower, but just for whatever reason. And in comparison, you see a traditionally done long pole. It has pretty much a square edge or a square angle inside that long pole. So I do think that it's easier to catch your fingernail on the square angle of a long pole versus on this rounded long pole. But I haven't really had my fingernail slip off of the main blade at all. So it's really only been this blade, and it doesn't happen very often. So it's not a huge deal, but it's just something where if you are, you know, familiar with the traditional way of making a long pole, it's something that you might have to get used to using this rounded type of long pole. And I did have a shuffler, which is the version of this knife with just the clip point, and the clip point was pinchable, as well as I believe the Dom, the sheepfoot version, and the round head, the spear point version, are all pinchable also. So, you know, be aware that there are also single blade versions of this in the clip point, a sheepfoot, and a round head, or I'm sorry, a spear point called the round head, but not a Wharncliffe. So there are some downsides, I think, to it being a 2-blade. It is thicker, you know, you can't pinch the blades, But the upside is that you're getting a lot of edge out of a pretty small frame. So if you look, when I open both blades, you're getting a solid maybe 5 inches, maybe even more, 5.5 inches of edge of M390 steel, whereas you get 4 inches and on a modern knife, and you can see that it takes a lot more handle to get that 4 inches than it does on a 2-bladed knife. So because it's a 2-bladed knife and it has that premium steel, you're packing a lot of really high-end steel into a small frame, so you're going to be able to cut with this knife for a long time without having to sharpen it and things like that. And speaking of cutting, I think that these blades are ground really well. Again, I didn't actually use this one, but it looks to me, let's see how well this will focus, it looks to me like it's ground really thinly. If you look right here at the kick, if we look kind of right down the barrel here, so hopefully it'll adjust. Nice and thinly ground, the edges seem even, the swedges look even to me, and that's true on both blades. So again, nice and thinly ground. So I think that these blades are going to, cut really well, especially with that M390 steel. And so overall, my thoughts on this knife are that it's something that I think the market does need. So companies like Great Eastern Cutlery, which is making the best production slip joint traditional knives out there right now, and Case don't really use these high-end materials. Case will use carbon fiber sometimes, not really titanium, and neither of them use modern blade steels. Case uses CV, which is basically 1095 with a little bit of a vanadium, I think, and True Sharp, which is like low-end stainless steel, and Great Eastern Cutlery uses 1095 and 440C. So none of those are modern or high-end steels. So it's really nice to be able to get a slip joint with some traditional characteristics as being a Barlow with traditional blade shapes and everything like that, with some upgrades, right? So the stop pin, so that you're not going to have to sharpen it a million times before it stops having blade wrap. The titanium, so it's a little lighter and it has that nice look from the brushed finish. The carbon fiber, again, so it's light but has that nice look and some matteness to it. And most of all, the blade steel, the M390, that is certainly a much better steel than 440C or True Sharp. So I think that it's good that LionSteel is willing to do that, and that Mike of Collector Knives is willing to, order these knives and sell them and make them available, because I think it's something that the market needs to help continue the renaissance of traditional knives and slip joint knives. They've certainly become more popular. More companies are making slip joint knives. A lot of them, modern type slip joint knives like this. Things like the Benchmade Proper and Fox, another Italian company, is making a lot of slip joints. Spyderco's actually been making modern slip joints for a long time, but theirs are often one hand open. And I just think that's a good thing for the market, especially for someone like me, and probably you if you're watching this, who likes traditional slip joint knives. So I really appreciate that Mike, LionSteel Collector Knives, are bringing these modern Barlows and other modern slip joints to the market. And it's a really nicely made knife. I think also a really good looking knife, although I still do think that the pins look a little bit more classic than the torque screws. But still a really nice knife, a knife that you could do a lot of work with, a knife that's gonna look nice, very easily could be, a go to meeting or go to church type fancy carry, and just overall a cool knife that I've been happy to get to check out. So if you've enjoyed this knife, don't forget to, again, go to theknifethoughts.com and check out the article on this knife with links to collectorknives.net where you can get it. Check out my social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, even Tumblr, all at Knife Thoughts. And finally, don't forget to go out and do good.